CMMCS made its annual visit to Mallory Park in May for the next round of the season in 2023 for all three series. First up would be the TinTops, and it'd be Chris Bassett on pole position ahead of Bradley Lane, Neil Gardner, Dave Charlton and myself. Ken Angell was in 6th ahead of Adrian Matthews, Rick Scalzi, Sam Hayward, Gideon September, Nick Lunn, Ian Seal and Angelo Massinetto. Bob Hosier was racing with the TinTops but was moved over to the Super Saloons with a technical infringement found after qualifying. Bassett would edge clear at the start, closely followed by Brad Lane. The two very similar on pace for the majority of this race. Chris Bassett, his fastest lap, a 51.3, with Brad Lane on a 51.5, showing there's minimal difference between these top two drivers this weekend. Chris Bassett would end up winning the race ahead of Brad, and third position would go to a slightly lonely Neil Gardner in his Civic. He ended up 33 seconds behind the leader Bassett, his best lap time of 52.8. Those top three were in Class T2, so it would be fourth position Dave Charlton winning Class T1 in his Seat Leon, just ahead of Ken Angell. The two had a great scrap through the majority of this race, just over half a second separating the two by the end of this race at Mallory Park. So Ken would be 5th ahead of Adrian Matthews in 6th. I would finish in 7th position ahead of Gideon September. Rick Scalzi back in the series, this time in his BMW Compact. He would finish in 9th place, a good result in that car. Ahead of Nick Lunn in P10 in his Class TP Honda Integra. Next would be Sam Hayward rejoining the series after a couple of outings last season. Then Ian Seal in 12th and Angelo Massinetto winning Class T3 in 13th. Some superb battles throughout that first race of the day. It was a 7.5 second winning margin for Chris Bassett in the end, but a close battle between Charlton, Angell, Matthews and myself. The majority of that race was probably the highlight in terms of battling out on track. But other close battles would see Nick Lunn just ahead of Sam Hayward, and Ian Seal wasn't too far behind them either. We'll then head to the second race of the TinTops later in the day. It will of course be Chris Bassett on pole once more after taking the win in the first race of the day. The second race starting order being the results from the first race. So Bassett would win once more in this second race of the day ahead of Brad Lane. The reason for a shortened race, however, was because of an unfortunate incident for Neil Gardner. He lost his brakes going into the penultimate turn, and unfortunately big damage to his car. Neil would end up having to go to hospital. Thankfully we hear that Neil is getting better, and hopefully we'll see him back out on track sometime this year. So Bassett's winning margin at the red flag would be 2 seconds over Brad Lane. In third position would be Dave Charlton winning Class T1. Ken Angell would be in second place within Class T1, but this time just over 5 seconds back. He was closely followed by Adrian Matthews, 0.2 of a second behind, and myself 2 seconds further back. Then it would be Gideon September in 7th, Sam Hayward would be in 8th ahead of Nick Lunn, Rick Scalzi, Ian Seal and Angelo Massinetto. There are some good scraps in this second race of the day in the mid-pack. A really good battle between Sam Hayward, Nick Lunn and Rick Scalzi was probably the highlight from this race. Some really close racing between the three of those. The fastest laps within each class: Chris Bassett within Class T2, a 51.6, Dave Charlton within T1, a 54.3, myself within Class TP, a 54.7, and Angelo Massinetto within Class T3, a 59.331. Of course, the DNF would be Neil Gardner in this race, even though of course he completed 12 laps, but unfortunately because he was the cause of the red flag, he was down as a DNF, which is of course a shame for him, but we're wishing him the best and hopefully we'll see him back out on track before the end of the season. 2 extra awards for the TinTops this year. They're going to the drivers of the weekend. 2 drivers for the second round of the season. They went to Rick Scalzi for a great performance all weekend in his T1 BMW Compact, and also to Nick Lunn, returning to the series this year on a more prominent basis, and a really good performance from him all weekend. So those 2 drivers win the Driver of the Weekend award. Soon after we'd move on to the BMR Caesar Electrical Super Saloons for the CMMCS, and first that would be qualifying of course once more. Qualifying will see Rod Birley on pole position in his BMW E36 on a 49.2, ahead of Ronan Bradley, Adrian Bradley and Marcus Bicknell in his Ford Taurus Ascar in 4th position. Next up will be Brad Lane, a fantastic performance in his TinTop, going over to the Super Saloons because they had separate grids this year. A really special performance there in qualifying to be 5th place overall in his Class D car, and of course, whilst other cars in his class might be running slicks, Brad's still on his semi-slick tyres. Then Mike Thurley would be in 6th, ahead of Martin Reynolds, who is also the Class C leader, ahead of Dave Avis, Jack Whitehead, Class C leader, Lee Mannix, Steve Dan, Bob Hosier, Lee Clough and Steve Rothery having to start at the back of the field after having technical issues in qualifying in his Peugeot 308. Race 1 would be an interesting affair between the top two, especially really close throughout the whole of this first race. Rod Birley versus Adrian Bradley. Throughout the whole race they were separated by no more than a second, lap after lap. Would Adrian get past? We weren't sure. He was very close on a number of occasions. Rod holding off though to take another victory within the CMMCS, winning Class A along with it. Adrian Bradley would be in 2nd position and of course the Class B winner as well. Steve Rothery coming from the back of the grid all the way up into 3rd position in his Peugeot 308. A super performance that saw him also get the Driver of the Weekend award for the Super Saloons. He was followed by Ronan Bradley after a slight mishap early on, but he had fantastic pace, pretty much similar to the leaders, so it would be interesting to see who would have won if all three of those were together throughout this whole race. Martin Reynolds would be next, winning Class C, ahead of Marcus Bicknell, Brad Lane winning Class D, Jack Whitehead winning Class C, Dave Avis would be followed by Lee Maddox, Steve Dan, Bob Hosier and Lee Clough. Nice to see all drivers finishing this first race of the day. The second race for the Super Saloons was due to take place just after the TinTops, so unfortunately the big incident at the end of Saturday which curtailed the racing for the Saturday part of the weekend, but unfortunately see the Super Saloons not get out for a second race of the weekend, but they were refunded partial entry fee for missing out on this second race of the weekend. And of course all of the Super Saloons and TinTops will be back in action at Brands Hatch, the next round of the season, the Brands Hatch Grand Prix circuit, so a really big event for all drivers, so that will be a really interesting event when that comes up at the start of July. But let's finish off our weekend roundup with the Intermark Silhouettes, which took place on the Sunday of this weekend. Up bright and early for the second part of this big weekend at Mallory Park, we'll see Lewis Smith take pole position in his Mercedes SLK, 1/10 of a second ahead of Colin Smith. Keith White would be the leading senior runner in his BMW Z4, ahead of Ian Hales in 4th, Daniel Smith, Ruben Taylor, Paul Knight, Phil Spinks, Richard Smith, Scott Abrigliano, John Price, Philip Young, Fabiola Ferrelli, Chris Ayling, Baz Johnson, Sean Pooley and Mick Robertson were the 17 qualifiers for this Intermark Silhouette race at Mallory Park. A frantic race would see some great scraps towards the front of the field and would eventually see Ian Hales win the race 1.5 seconds ahead of Paul Knight, with Keith White in 3rd position. Paul Knight and Keith White the two top senior runners as well. Ruben Taylor put in another good performance to see him finish in 4th place ahead of Phil Spinks, who was the 3rd senior runner, ahead of Scott Aprigliano, John Price, Philip Young, Chris Ayling and Sean Pooley in 10th in his autocross VW Corrado. Great to see that car back out in action as well. Really well turned out, and hopefully we'll see Sean for the majority of the season. Unfortunately we did have some retirements from this first race of the weekend. Colin Smith would unfortunately be the cause of the end of race red flag, meaning he was a non-classification, even though he was only 9/10 of a second behind Ian Hales on the road as they went on to that final lap before the red flag. But unfortunately Colin Smith not picking up the finish due to the red flag. Richard Smith, Baz Johnson, Daniel Smith and Mick Robertson also did not complete the race. Unfortunately some technical issues there. Hopefully we'll see majority of them out for the rest of the season. Of course some of them made it out for race 2 as well. The reverse grid saw Scott Aprigliano on pole position alongside Phil Spinks, Ruben Taylor, Keith White, Paul Knight and Ian Hales being the top 6 on the reverse grid. And it would be a really good performance from Paul Knight to put in some fantastic lap times, keep it clean throughout and eventually take the win, and also the leading senior as well, so great to see him taking all honours here at Mallory Park in the second race of the day. He would be followed home by Keith White, the next senior runner, Daniel Smith in 3rd, ahead of Ruben Taylor, Phil Spinks, Philip Young, Chris Ayling, John Price, would be the 8 finishers ahead of some of the non-classified finishers. Scott Ebrion, unfortunately from pole position, couldn't make it to the flag despite some good pace throughout. Sean Pooley, Ian Hales also had some great performances throughout this race. He also got the second best lap time throughout this race, 48.6, ahead of Baz Johnson and Mick Robertson, the rest of the non-classified runners. Paul Knight getting the fastest lap of the race, 48.4 in his Vauxhall Tigra. Now all races will return at Brands Hatch GP for a combined grid. All 3 series will be on the same grid at Brands Hatch GP in just over a month's time. But for the Intermark Silhouettes, they'll have a round in between at the American Speedfest, one of the biggest events of the season in the UK. So be sure to get down to Brands Hatch, even as a spectator, to watch this fantastic event unfold in the early part of June. Of course, more information is on the CMMCS website, which will be linked down in the description of this YouTube video. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all the marshals. Thank you to everyone at the CMMCS for putting on a great show, and all the drivers, teams, everyone involved putting on a really great weekend's worth of racing. So we'll see you soon at Brands Hatch for the American Speedfest, and all drivers and all teams will be racing at the Brands Hatch Grand Prix circuit at the start of July. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.